Hello, everyone. My name is Rachael Wonnacott, and I'm the technical product owner for the Kubernetes platform at Fidelity International. I spent the best part of a decade as a platform engineer, so I'm slowly acclimatizing to talking about leadership rather than the deep technology. So this is really aimed at your leaders, be they team leaders or senior leaders. And I'm going to talk to you about building a platform for your ecosystem. And I'm going to give away the answer right at the start of the talk, and that is, your platform is not an island. But your organization is an ecosystem. And for those of you that studied biology, you might be familiar with the following definition of an ecosystem. And that is a biological community of interacting organisms and their physical environment. And in the enterprise, that can be analogous to your people, your variety of teams, and the organizational structure within which they fit. And to me, biology felt like a really good analogy because companies typically grow organically. We don't necessarily plan things from the start. And over time, you will be subject to evolution. But the question is, do you survive? In a startup, the whole company itself might, in fact, be just one team. People are typically wearing many hats, and even as things begin to grow, there might not be clear-cut team boundaries, if indeed you have any at all. And with larger scale startups or scale-ups, as things merge organically, without conscious organizational architecture, you're likely going to have silos that tend towards technologies. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, to reference the previous talk, but if it's not done intentionally, it can create barriers to fast flow. The larger the organization, by sheer virtue of size, the more possible combinations of these teams and structures, and the harder it will become later to retrofit that intentional organizational design for a flourishing ecosystem, or in the case of the business, fast flow. I want to call out that the challenges facing smaller organizations versus larger organizations are very different. And in the realms of platform engineering, as I've alluded to in a startup, you may not even need a platform at all. So I want to talk about enterprises, and by enterprises, I mean organizations with many, many teams, and also most likely many years of tenure. But with many years of tenure comes lots of existing process, unfortunately. And so your ecosystem is not just your people, your teams, and your organizational structure, but it's also your processes and your maturity. Okay, so organizations that predate cloud quite often have structures that have been influenced by their on-premises infrastructure. And that kind of makes sense. Most of these organizations existed when most, if not all of your infrastructure was managed in-house and required highly skilled, dedicated teams. And so the limitations of the technology, the skill sets of the people, and the cultural practices that were accepted at the time dictated a much more rigid relationship between your application teams and your infrastructure teams. And I think a lot of people in the room will remember a time before DevOps. And at that time, we have something like this, where the application team would wrap up a lovely present and throw it over the wall for ops, and they'd cross their fingers and hope that it works. In the world of cloud, however, much of those originally clear-cut team boundaries between technologies, or indeed just layers of the stack, have been brought together and blurred. In a previous life, it was OK just to be a specialist network engineer. But when you're deploying to cloud, networking isn't the only skill that you need, albeit it is still an essential one. So it means that even if pockets of your organization have modernized or moved towards DevOps, or better yet, or operating in the product model, you likely still have lots of areas of the business that aren't operating in this way, which can create a lot of interaction points and, unfortunately, lots of potential points for friction. So there are lots of potential silos on the screen. And I would say it's also fair to say that most organizations will need to pass through the hybrid model at some point on that destination to the pearly gates of becoming cloud native, if indeed that even is still the goal. So you're very likely to have a variety of different working methodologies in your teams, different team structures, but also lots of different silos. So you can probably guess what some of these are, but just in case you need some clues. And the more teams that you have, the more people that you might need to speak to, the increased number of working practices you might have, and once again, unfortunately, the harder it will be to establish a consensus. Okay, so you're all bored at this point. Why exactly have I bothered to spend 5 minutes talking to you about the DevOps origin story, when you probably think that you know it already? Well, as the grandfather of DevOps himself, Patrick Dubois, reflected at the end of last year, maybe now things have changed in a way that are not so clear-cut anymore. We're not dev and ops separately. Now we're more, we've got 15 teams, they're all running their own stuff, and they actually need to start collaborating. So all we've really done is shift the complexity of frustration to that number of teams. This is, of course, not visible in many startups where you might only have one team, but this becomes increasingly challenging in the enterprise where you have many, many teams. And perhaps that's simply the reality of DevOps at scale. So even in the perfect world where everyone moved away from silos and moved towards DevOps, we've still introduced complexity into the organization. Oh, okay, this is how I feel telling you all about DevOps and how it's not working. And it's actually really like a quote that my boss sent to me on Teams last night, which I've shoehorned in, so he'll be sweating when he reads this. It's a maturity thing too. People now realize not everyone is going to be shit hot at everything, as was promised originally with DevOps, or it's just really expensive to do, as organizations explode with complexity with every team doing it their way. Hi, Dean, I hope you're watching. So what then is the reality in the enterprise? Well, there's a lot going on, and this isn't an exhaustive list. It's just what I came up with while I was writing this presentation a couple of weeks ago. And as I indicated earlier, most enterprises are likely in that hybrid model of on-premises and cloud native, which means, again, unfortunately, there's likely still some legacy technologies, legacy team structures, and probably processes as well. Which means, in many cases, there are going to be on-premises dependencies for your cloud applications, which, of course, is an anti-pattern to cloud native. This typically results in overly distributed systems. Legacy processes are most often incongruent with your modern engineering practices, which will inevitably create friction between those teams. And there's also likely to be friction between those teams that identify as being DevOps and those teams that are operating in more traditional team setups, because they won't have the prerequisite empathy to understand where the other is coming from. In any large institution, you've probably also got quite a large cross-section of the maturity model. You're going to have people that are 10 start up here and people that are starting out down at the bottom. So you need to build systems or platforms that can cater for both. And when you've got lots of people doing DevOps, as we've mentioned on the previous slide with Dean, lots of teams are doing it their way, which can result in duplication. Arguably worse than that, though, than duplication, is it leads to several different ways of doing the same thing. And often some of those are far more complicated than they needed to be, which in most cases is neither resource nor cost efficient. Okay, lots of negativity, I apologize. Why is it then that we want to build platforms? Well, platforms seek to solve all of those challenges, if not more of those challenges that we've just spoken about on the previous slide. Now, the requirement for an internal developer platform implies multiple workloads. So it's really no surprise then they're of such great interest to the enterprise. Many of the reasons why organizations are choosing to build platforms are in fact interrelated, but I'd like to talk about it in 3 personas. I've spoken about DevOps wanting to remove friction, but what are we trying to remove friction for? Well, the business, or the enterprise, will tell you it's about delivering more frequently at a lower cost. But there is also the frustration of a team simply not being able to deliver to a deadline, or worse, not being able to do what they identify as being their job. Worst case again, because they're blocked by another team that sits within their own organization, again, creating friction. And the final persona, which I don't think we talk about quite enough, is the individual. So I'm hoping some of you in here identify as being an individual contributor. This one is for you. There is simply nothing more frustrating than working without results and not feeling like you have an impact. If you want to retain your talent, you need to be thinking about the individual persona as well when you build your platform. So in many ways, platform engineering is about removing friction for the business, removing it for the teams that work day to day, but also, please, about the individual. So it should be no surprise that when I talk about platform engineering, it often comes up with conversations around the developer experience. Right. We're kind of coming to a little bit of a conclusion here, and then we're going to get into a case study. It's fair to say, I would think, that DevOps works excellently within teams, especially if those teams are afforded the possibility to own all of their dependencies. However, it doesn't address the challenge of where that team sits in the ecosystem, and eventually you're quite likely to need to ask another team for something, or simply your organization wants to address the duplication, the cost challenges, or the complexity that we've already discussed. And in much the same way, you need to consider where your platform sits, how it will operate within your enterprise. So that is to say, your platform is not an island. Right, we're going to do a case study. I always enjoyed the talks that got into the dirty laundry, so I'm going to reveal our full journey, warts and all. So it's not perfect, but I'm going to call out some places that we went wrong and hopefully allow you to learn from our mistakes. So before public cloud, where were we? If you remember that cloud infrastructure is really just somebody else's infrastructure, we were doing cloud a long time before our foray into public cloud. And we operated an internal cloud platform on physical tin using Cloud Foundry. That's how I started my life as an engineer after physics. And platform engineering has become really popular recently, but I would argue it's not that new a concept. PaaS, or platform as a service, was really popular over a decade ago and saw large success with open source technologies such as Cloud Foundry and the work that Pivotal did to aid the developer experience using PCF. So we started out with the commercial offering of the PaaS and then later migrated to a fully open source platform. And to be honest, this was pretty successful. It did reduce cognitive load and it was pretty popular amongst our developers. But we wanted to go all in. We wanted to go to public cloud. We were promised the cost savings of public cloud, the reduced infrastructure management responsibilities of using an IaaS rover running things on physical tin, and we were aspiring to have all of our teams follow the DevOps model or become product ownership teams. We needed to give our teams somewhere they could be entirely autonomous in the cloud to take that end-to-end responsibility of their applications. And we did this by automating the provisioning of cloud accounts that were essentially private mini data centers for each team. We also implemented a shared responsibility model to manage this between the workload teams and the platform team, where the platform team was designing, deploying, supporting all of the core infrastructure. So that's everything from DNS, internet egress via a proxy, ingress to the platform, connectivity back to on-premises, all of your typical back-end infrastructure services. And the workload team were responsible for any additional resources they deployed on top into their data center, their application code, their configuration, but ultimately the performance and the uptime of their apps. And this worked really, really well for some teams. And it's still working really well. Again, only for some teams. So, as I mentioned earlier, large organizations will largely have a cross-section of maturity, and Fidelity was no different. So we found that one size would not fit all. So we're still running this platform, and it has great success, but we also needed something else. This is an actual slide from an architecture review board that I presented over a year ago, which is why it's in the corporate colors. And this is a direct quote from a developer that works in the business. And essentially what they were saying is that they really wanted to be experts in their application code, and they wanted somebody else to be the expert for the infrastructure. And for me, as someone that had been really purist 10 years ago about DevOps, I wasn't sure I was bought into this, so we did a little bit more research. And a lot of different publications online were talking about the time that web developers were taking or spending writing code versus looking after everything else. And this particular one says, on average, a cloud developer only spends 11% of their time actually writing the code. And so I started to buy in a little bit. Could we enable the experts of the apps to build those wonderful apps and take away some of that cognitive load with a platform? Now, when I give a talk, it's quite often that I bring Dan in. So Dan's at the front here. He was in the audience also when I gave this presentation. It doesn't look like me, but I promise this was me as an engineer. That's 2018 in Basel for Cloud Foundry Summit. But why am I showing you this? Well, actually, we've gone full circle. So what I was saying here is that we wanted the developers to only need to think about their applications and the data, and we wanted to obfuscate the rest of this with the platform. And I'm saying that we actually wanted to do that again. We'd come full circle. So now we're hybrid. We've got our on-premises legacy Cloud Foundry platform. we've got our public cloud mini data centers with full autonomy, but we still wanted to address this challenge. So was there another way? Fortunately, during the time that we've been building in public cloud, there was another technology that had been growing in huge popularity in the community. And for the eagle-eyed amongst you, or those that were listening to my introduction, I'm the technical product owner for the Kubernetes platform. So of course, that technology is indeed Kubernetes. In some ways, as I said, we've come full circle, but I'm going to show you how that affected our operating model. So again, another lovely slide from our architecture review board, and I won't go into all of the detail, but you can certainly read it if you want. We recognize that developers should have a choice. So the analogy that we're using is the hotel versus the house. And the reason we've used that analogy is it's much like going to a hotel. The service is given to you. You don't get to think about the color of your bed sheets or necessarily what's on the menu, but you get delivered a really high-quality service and you enjoy the experience. Versus your house, where you can paint the walls whatever you want. You could even have fur on your sofas, should you so desire. But the responsibility for looking after that house if there's a storm and the roof comes up is down to you. So we were saying, do you want to have pretty much everything managed for you, which means slightly less creativity, but no overhead of your infrastructure? Or would you like the full creativity and autonomy of public cloud, but you need to accept the responsibility for assuring those workloads and your back-end infrastructure? Right. Hopefully this is familiar. I am just talking about images here because this is within the context of Kubernetes, but you can take the principles that I'm going to talk through to other areas of the business as well for the software lifecycle. So we've openly admitted now that we're committed to hosting Kubernetes in public cloud, but we also wanted to understand the expectations from our on-premises developers that have come from Cloud Foundry. So while Kubernetes offers loads of benefits to the organization, it does ultimately offer a little bit less to the developer in its rawest form. So Cloud Foundry was taking care of build image, store image, deploy image, and run image, whereas our Kubernetes platform is really just running the image. So if the developer doesn't really care about the underlying platform, are they now getting less? This was a problem. Now, I really wanted to highlight this, particularly for senior leadership, because when they were considering the technologies, as they're further away from the day-to-day work, they heard container orchestration and assumed it was like for like, but from the developer experience, that actually wasn't the case. So as I've said, there's already a reasonable discrepancy here. So if Kate's is only running the image, what is now, or who is now responsible for building, storing, and deploying? To bring this right back to the title of my talk, as product owner, in some ways, if I'm being really black and white about my responsibility, I only have to care about running the image. This is somebody else's problem. But that's not organizational thinking, it's not leadership thinking, and it certainly isn't strategic thinking. So if I do choose to remember that the platform is not an island, I need to consider everything left of my platform and how that's going to affect onboarding to my platform and ultimately the overarching developer experience. And to be honest, this is fairly logical anyway from an adoption perspective, as it doesn't matter how beautifully we build the Kubernetes platform or how fantastic our engineers are. They're great, by the way. If no app team ever onboards to our platform, if they get stuck somewhere along here, you can bet they won't make it to the platform. So on second look at the application lifecycle, what did we do? What challenges arose? Well, firstly, we're asking the question of what ecosystem are we building in? And due to our existing organizational structure, many of the tools responsible for these different stages in the lifecycle are actually operated by different teams. And each of these different tools had varying levels of self-service versus self-management. So that's some inconsistency. And given our new operating model, so that hotel and the house, said that we want to have a hotel-like experience from the Kubernetes platform, you're probably going to argue that this isn't a hotel experience. It's more like a motel up the road or a tent when you've gone camping with your parents when you were 8. It wasn't my favorite holiday. So we needed to consider how our Kubernetes platform was going to affect our operating model. And to be really honest, this was a bit of a panicked moment for me when I took this role, because it became very clear, due to a variety of different working methodologies of the teams, the existing interactions weren't going to be successful. And there were so many different engagement processes, so many different sets of documentation. It was really hard for a developer to actually figure out what they needed to do. So can we create a golden path? Ultimately, developers want as smooth and consistent experience across the lifecycle as possible, a golden path, if you will. And there's a really nice quote here from Casper from Humanitech that any procedure in the software development lifecycle a user can follow with minimal cognitive load and that drives standardization is a golden path. So that's what I'm talking about when I say golden path. A smoother path can be created by reducing the number of interaction points or hops in that application lifecycle that you've seen. And where there has to be a variety of interactions, you can lower the barrier to entry by standardizing that process. And standardizing can mean many things. This could be standardizing the way teams expect to be interacted with by ensuring appropriate interaction modes, as very well described by the book Team Topologies. Don't have time to delve in that here, but I do highly recommend that book. Or more technically, it can be achieved via dynamic configuration approaches and declarative config. I'd love to go more into the tech detail, but again, this is a leadership talk. So most fundamentally, having a strategic shared definition of done across the lifecycle, and more likely the organization, which requires strong leadership. So you've got to meet the people where they're at. And this goes back to the varying maturity that I mentioned throughout this talk, both in skill level, but also in conceptualization. You want the developers to have a consistent way of communicating with teams. But if you choose to build your platform in isolation, and you try to optimize the way the teams interact with you in isolation, you can really have the best intentions, but they may not meet you where the user is at. So to quote Abby, don't hate the ticket portals. She's going to love that I've quoted her on this. Consider offering an option they are already familiar with, yes, even if that means ticket portals. And I feel like Abby really articulated this well, because I wasn't bought in initially at KubeCon in March, but people need to get onto the platform, so sometimes you can lower the barrier to entry by meeting them where they're at. Once you've got them bought in, and they're familiar with your tool, and they're in love with Kubernetes, then you can move them on to something more modern in approach. Fortunately, at Fidelity, we're fairly fortunate that that road has already been paved by the work that we've done with our cloud account team. And so the concept of using pull requests as the entry point is actually very well socialized already among our developers. This approach also allows us to aid in delivering transparency of what's ultimately a distributed service behind the scene. People shouldn't necessarily know how distributed all those services are for your platform. They just want to see one entry point. And to do this, you can use a dynamic configuration generation approach. Humanitech have some really great talks on this online from last year if you wanted to take a look. The developer entry point is simplified for us using declarative config. So all I really mean by this is that developers will specify their desired state and let the configuration management tool, or in this case, the platform orchestrator, determine how to deploy it. The deployment mechanism should be transparent to the end user. As I've said, there can be a variety of services on the platform, and they can be delivered by different teams. Your platform team doesn't have to build everything themselves, and I will give some examples later. But all must be presented to the customer by the same declarative config. This is really great because it allows us to do what I keep banging on about, and that's standardize the entry point to all of the services, regardless of whether they are owned by the platform team or somebody else. We've done this using GitOps, so all of our changes are driven by a customer pull request. And this is actually really nice within the enterprise because we can enforce a point of review or even security approval for something that needs to be audited without the platform team needing to be a middleman between the developer and the platform. The last I'll say is just at the bottom, and this is only possible by having an abstract description of your workload. So to give you a really simple example, microservice of name X has dependency on database type Postgres and requires persistent storage of quota 100 gig. There's quite a lot going on in this picture, so I recommend you look at it later. I have taken this lovingly from the Cloud Native Computing Foundation Platform Working Group, which illustrates this relationship between products, platforms, and capability providers. So again, talking about that bridge that the platform provides and having everything else hidden behind the scenes. So the features a platform offers, whatever you choose those to be, should be based on user requirement and stakeholder need. And you curate that by assessing those needs. It's as much about saying no as it is about saying yes. So if you think about a bell curve, we're targeting the 80% that are migrating away from Cloud Foundry. We're not thinking about the 10% top performers, and we're also not thinking about the 10% stragglers at the bottom. We're also not necessarily thinking about odd, bespoke use cases. That can be dealt with separately. We're going after the majority. So while platforms provide these functionalities, the platform team doesn't always have to build everything, like I've said. So you can have those specialized internal teams or complicated subsystem teams, if you're familiar with team topologies. And in our case, we have a data services team providing a database as a service. Our user, however, still comes to us via that one piece of declarative config. They're not aware that it's their pipeline delivering the data services outcome. They just come to the platform, and everything is brought together behind the scenes. So the platform itself is acting as a central layer and ensuring everything works together smoothly and meets your organization's specific requirements. So it's that bridge concept, once again. In this role, they not only provide access to these capabilities, but we can also enforce best practices. If you work in a regulated environment, we're financial, so FCA regulated, it's actually a really nice way for us to enforce standardization of security, performance, cost effectiveness, compliance, and give a consistent user experience for everyone. It's easier for us to go to audit with a holistic view and evidence how we're achieving all of these controls by having a standard process. Okay, so how to apply this to your enterprise? So we did a little bit of mapping of how many teams were involved in each of these steps. This is actually the developer. We've got a tools team, a security team, and a platform team. I've not labeled them because it's superfluous to my argument, but as you can see, there's lots of different team interactions, and I would say too many team interactions happening here. So map out all of those individual hops that your developers need to make as part of your application lifecycle. And then map the different teams who run those services and those technologies. Understand the different interaction expectations of these teams. Are they the same? Are they different? Are they optimized? And you've got to bring the people together to do that. And that's quite a difficult point. It's going to take really strong leadership. It's going to take a lot of patience. It's going to take a lot of resilience, empathy, and a willingness to build something that aims to be better for the organization, not for your individual team. So when you're thinking about HR and recruitment, you need to think about how you incentivize your teams working, and don't have those individual key performance metrics that don't incentivize the collaboration that you will need to build this golden path. To do that, can you sell the developer experience? See where it's possible to standardize the human interactions, because the biggest challenge is probably going to be standardizing interfaces between systems, which may not always be possible. So instead, try and make that single entry point to the lifecycle using code. I personally love the GitOps approach, but there are other ways that you can do this as well. Dynamic configuration generation is fantastic. Again, I'm going to promote that talk from Casper from Humanitech. I loved it. And try and abstract all away that underlying logic. Once you've done that, can you smooth the process? So this is where we're at right now. It's not perfect, but it looks a lot better than it did previously. So the handoff between the teams now only happens once. We have 3 different teams rather than 4, and this essentially becomes one section, and this essentially becomes another. This is the platform team, this is the tools team, and the developer here just gets to write some code, which, if we remember their quote, is actually all they wanted to do in the first place. So, lots of things to consider, and I could probably write 3 more talks on the same subject. Thank you so much for having me. To close, please remember your platform is not an island.